Kelly O'Donnell at the White House. Kelly, in listening to the questions there, largely focused on what could be a meeting as early as next week between President Trump, President Putin, and President Zelensky, with the goal of trying to bring the war there to an end. And the president was asked about the deadline that he imposed, saying that he would impose tariffs this week if this war did not end on Russia. He was asked about that. Does that deadline hold? He said, well, that's up to him, meaning Putin. Will see about what he has to say, basically saying it seems like he wants to give some space for these talks to move forward. What did you make of what we just heard, Kelly?
Well, that's a very good point, because the question was about the president's own decision-making and if he would adhere to a deadline that he himself set, not about the response from Vladimir Putin. So he did give plenty of wiggle room there on that issue. As we know, the president had originally set a 50-day deadline that had cut it down to 10 or 12. Then he set a fixed point of tomorrow for a deadline for Putin to accept a ceasefire or face additional financial penalties and tariffs and sanctions, a whole package of those things that have not been fully discussed. But that idea coming from the United States and targeting nations that do business with Russia to cut off some of Russia's financial power that is necessary to wage a war. So that was notable. Also, the president backed away from his stated goal that there would be a condition for President Zelensky of Ukraine, to be included. Now the president is saying that he would meet because he wants to bring about an end to this war. That is certainly a goal many people would like to see achieved. But the president typically, in recent weeks, has been very much acknowledging his disappointment in dealing with Vladimir Putin. So without Zelensky there, it's unclear how they would achieve that. All to be sorted out. What we have seen unfolding here is that the idea of such a meeting has been floated, a timeline loosely beginning as early as next week. We don't have a location yet. That is complicated because Putin could be arrested if he leaves Russia to certain other countries that would honor the ICC indictment on him as a war criminal for waging war in Ukraine. And there are friendly nations. Some have been talked about, including the United Arab Emirates, perhaps Turkey, some other options that might exist. So when and where are still questions. Who apparently is a bit of a question. Would Zelensky be involved or not? But clearly the president wants to move forward on this for both substantive reasons. I think he genuinely would want to see an end to war. Many across the globe would like to see an end to war. It also has the great potential of dominating headlines and changing up some of the headlines, whether it's economic or Epstein-related or what have you, that might be dogging the president a bit.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.